President Obama talking to a number of very wealthy donors, including Bill Gates. He says, in fact, there are 5 or 6 people in this room tonight who could determine, if not who is elected president, at least who gets the major party nomination.
Hi, I'm Reihan Salam. Today, Vice meets Ken Vogel, the author of Big Money and chief investigative reporter for Politico. Ken, tell us about Big Money.
Big Money was my effort to sort of show this new political system that we see developing after the Supreme Court decisions allowed unlimited political spending. We have all these major donors who are rushing in and having a huge impact on our politics. There are a lot of sort of easy stereotypes that evolve around these big donors, sort of their, Machiavellian interest, their secretive nature. This was my effort to pull back the curtain, show readers a little bit about who these big donors were, what motivated them, how this process worked, and what impact it's having on our politics, because it is a huge impact.
Big money is about big money in politics. Yet I wonder, big money has been a part of politics for a very, very long time. So what you're suggesting in the book is that something new has happened, something has changed.
Something very big has changed, and what's happened is that the big money has flowed from being controlled by and sort of harnessed by the political parties in a very organized way, by the establishment, if you will, to flowing outside of the party, to the point where it's controlled now by these sort of roving bands of operatives and the very wealthy donors who fund their projects and fund their initiatives. And even further than that, there are rogue donors who sort of branch out on their own, who become huge political powers in their own right. So it's sort of the privatization of the big money. It's going from inside a system that, while it had its many flaws, it sort of had some semblance of public accountability, the political party system that is, to outside the system, an increasingly secretive sort of shadow party system that now controls politics by virtue of being able to harness this huge, unprecedented flow of money. So the money is both more. There is demonstrably more money, even if adjusted for cost of living and inflation. And then it's also being controlled less by the parties and more by these rogue billionaires.
So when you talk about the political parties, they used to exert this control. The money would be channeled through the political party, and there's a certain accountability there, partly because the party has a brand, the party doesn't want to damage that brand necessarily, and it's able to, let's say, exert some control over candidates. But my understanding is that the parties were actually weakened because generations of campaign finance reformers were actually trying to fix the system. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people look towards these 2010 federal court decisions. The big one is the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, and there were some subsequent ones. There are actually a few prior ones going back to like 2007 or so. But you make a very good point. This evolution started before those. It started back in really 2002 when we saw the McCain-Feingold bill, and what this was hailed as like a great step forward in taking money out of politics, but it really had the opposite effect. What it did was limit the amount of big money that the political parties could take. They used to be able to take unlimited checks from individuals, unions,
take us back a little bit. What were the problems that people thought McCain-Feingold would solve? I mean, so back in the 80s and 90s, what were the big problems that people had with the way campaign finance worked back then?
I mean, they essentially thought that the political parties were being purchased by these wealthy individuals and corporations, and we saw manifestations of this. I talk in the book a little bit about how anytime there's a significant reform in campaign finance and getting money out of politics, it's usually prompted by a big scandal. So you go back to like the robber barons in the late
Watergate was the first big wave of campaign finance reform.
That's sort of the start of the modern campaign finance era. Since then, we've seen a few sort of incremental steps, but the next really big step was this 2002 McCain-Feingold bill.
McCain-Feingold, I mean, this was a big deal because, you have McCain, at the time, a widely lauded Republican presidential candidate. You've got Russ Feingold, who is considered a hero to a lot of progressives, working together on this big bill. It seemed, like a very promising idea.
It seemed like a promising idea, and even more than that, there was sort of a public a public call, public demand for change, because the system was seen as so corrupt, because these individuals and these corporations could essentially buy a plank in the party platform with these huge soft money contributions. So the manifestations that we really saw
soft money,
soft money are these unlimited contributions that fall outside of the sort of what we call the hard money caps, where there are hard caps that are now $5,000 per candidate per individual. Is how
Because
much
they don't go to a candidate or an individual. They go to, say, a party committee.
right.
So,
And so the
yeah.
parties were able to get around these hard money caps with this soft money.
Even though soft money doesn't technically go to a candidate, I guess the concern
Right.
might have been that it effectively is channeled.
Absolutely, and so there was quite a bit of public discomfort and sort of call for change because Bill Clinton was really the master of this, and it's interesting to sort of look forward to Hillary, who also, I think, was the master of these sort of big money contributions that were made illegal by McCain-Feingold are now legal again, but her husband during the Clinton presidency would actually rent out the Lincoln bedroom to these big contributors who gave these huge soft money contributions to the Democratic National Committee. Well, they could get to sleep over in the White House in exchange for these huge contributions. And there was also a corporate side of this that was really sort of brought into stark relief by the Enron scandal, right about the turn of the century. And so the combination of the Clinton
Because
scandals,
Enron was making substantial political contributions.
yeah, Enron was essentially gaming the system, and the thinking was that they sort of bought off, to put it in a very pejorative way, the regulators by giving these huge contributions to the folks who appointed the regulators, that is, governors, presidents.
And Enron was working in energy, so a very heavily regulated area where having that advantage, knowing politicians, having them on your side, made a huge difference.
Yeah, and then the thinking was that they essentially gamed the system by using this soft money conduit to put all this money into the process and to buy influence, and that as a result, their irregularities were not flagged by regulators who might have had an incentive to be less diligent in looking at them because the company had sort of bought influence with the folks who oversaw the oversight regulators. So those were the sort of, and then there were some other scandals, but those were the two big scandals, the Clinton fundraising scandals, and then Enron that really generated the public will, that generated the political will to pass McCain-Feingold. Well, fast forward 8 years, the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court struck down key parts of McCain-Feingold.
Even before Citizens United, it seems as though the McCain-Feingold regime started to unravel.
Yeah, the McCain-Feingold law actually had sort of an unintended consequence that has really been the catalyst for a lot of the evolution of the money from inside the system and outside the system that we've been talking about, by limiting the amount of money that the parties could take, banning them from taking these so-called soft money contributions. Well, there were still big donors and corporations that wanted to inject huge sums of cash into the system. They couldn't go to the parties. They started looking for new vehicles outside of the party system into which they could inject this cash. Some of the earlier vehicles were nonprofit corporations set up under the IRS under Section 527 of the IRS. In 2004, the first presidential election post McCain-Feingold, some of the most impactful spending was done by these quote 527 groups, including on the left. There were a few billionaires who, in many ways, were like the predecessors of this current mega donor craze that I write about. George Soros, the billionaire financier, Peter Lewis, the recently deceased insurance mogul, Progressive Insurance is his company. They spent around $200 million trying to defeat George Bush in 2004. And then on the other side of the ledger, there was the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth organization, went very aggressively after John Kerry's military service, trying to raise questions about his Vietnam service and effectively undercut what otherwise was really regarded as a big strength for him. So after the campaign, though, because there were still some of these laws in place that restricted how much money could be spent outside of the system, the Federal Election Commission and the Internal Revenue Service started poking around at some of this spending. Donors got subpoenas, it made folks uncomfortable, and so it kind of put the chill on this outside spending because there was a thought that, well, we could end up sort of provoking the ire of the regulators. Fast forward to 2010 with the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, got rid of a lot of those laws that the regulators would have used to sort of scrutinize some of this outside spending. So it was really, it was a free-for-all at that point, and that's where we are right now.
So one thing I wonder about is when you're looking at that period in the mid-2000s, a lot of this anger towards Bush, but then also you've got the people who were trying to defend him at the time, it seems that it actually did a lot to shape our current politics. For example, if you think about that netroots movement, these progressives, who felt that the Democrats in D.C. weren't tough enough against George W. Bush, that gave rise to Howard Dean, and then later you could say that gave rise to Barack Obama. So, you had that piece, but then even before Citizens United, you have the Tea Party movement. You have people who are saying that the establishment Republican Party is corrupt, it's not responsive to grassroots conservatives. So in a way you have in both parties that kind of anger against the party establishment and the party itself. So it seems as though that, did that create this opportunity for other people to fill the vacuum?
Absolutely, and the circumstances were right. There was this groundswell on both sides. What there wasn't was this huge cash infusion that sort of allowed, once Citizens United happened and the cash started coming in, it channeled this grassroots sentiment on both sides, probably a little bit more on the right, at least initially, where some of these groups that for years have been spending money on sort of public policy advocacy, small government advocacy, trying to reduce the size of government, reduce government spending, they had been sort of functioning in this wonky realm where there weren't a lot of folks on the ground, regular voters who cared about this stuff. Suddenly, with the Tea Party, they became sort of the ground troops, and then these
people who
court
pour
decisions,
money for these anti-establishment forces.
yeah, or even more than money. I mean, there are always very wealthy people who are willing to spend money on that stuff, but there weren't the ground troops, the folks who would actually go out and vote based on them, or knock on doors, or make phone calls based on them. Now you had both. You had the uprising. You had pre-existing the sort of popular sentiment. You had pre-existing the wealthy people willing to spend money. Then with the Supreme Court Citizens United decision and subsequent decisions, you had these new channels where they could spend this money directly on politics and give these people that were really interested suddenly the sort of infrastructure that was necessary to go ahead and channel their enthusiasm and really have an impact in politics.
So you had, the kindling, you had a little bit of a flame, and now you have the kerosene that you can throw on top of it, so that suddenly these things can become real, big deals. When you talk about money in politics, the names that come to mind first for a lot of people are the Koch brothers. Who are they, and where do they fit in this landscape?
So there's actually 4 Koch brothers, but the ones that we think of when we talk about the Koch brothers from a money and politics perspective are Charles and David Koch. They're these billionaire industrialists whose family owns. It's a privately held company, Koch Industries, and does all manner of manufacturing, oil refining, chemicals. Really has its tentacles, if you will, in all manner of stuff that frustrates liberals because it's really hard to boycott. But for years and years, they had been involved in this sort of wonky academic space where they were libertarians, both small L libertarians and big L libertarians. In fact, David Koch ran for vice president in 1980 on the Libertarian Party ticket.
Campaign on abolishing the FBI.
Yeah, they wanted to essentially strip a number of federal government agencies, including, interestingly, the Federal Election Commission, which was just getting its feet under it back then, and they supported getting rid of all campaign contribution limits. So a little foreshadowing there, because now they're spending a ton of money in politics, taking advantage in some ways of the Citizens United decision that allowed in a more overtly political way. This is a shift for them. They, for years, have been more sort of on the academic side, funding think tanks and funding organizations that did white papers.
But they saw the Tea Party as an opportunity, I guess.
Yeah, so a couple things happened. First of all, much like the Tea Party folks, there's this sort of mischaracterization, I think, out there about like the Tea Party rose up in opposition to Obama, but as you suggested, in fact, the Tea Party sort of groundswell started occurring during the latter years of the Bush administration when these mostly conservatives were upset with what they saw as unchecked government spending. Well, so too were the Koch brothers upset with what they saw as runaway government spending under the Bush administration, and harkening back to their libertarian roots, they saw the invasion of Iraq and our military involvement in the Middle East as a major problem, a major waste of money, an ill-advised foreign policy move. So they were already kind of becoming dissatisfied, and they were sort of wondering about the impact of all this money that they'd spent on think tanks, on white papers for the last 30 years. Well, what did it get them if you finally had a Republican president with a Republican Congress, and they were engaging in all these big spending, sort of world policeman-like activities that they thought to be anathema with their version of conservatism. So towards the middle of the Bush administration, they started getting together these big donors twice a year at these donor summits where they would talk about how their money could be spent more effectively to change society, to advance their sort of small government limited spending, low taxation ideas, and they were increasingly sort of edging towards the more political involvement by the end of the Bush administration. Well, Obama was elected, the Tea Party groundswell occurred, and then we had the Citizens United decision, and they too, with your analogy about the kerosene being poured on the fire, that is applicable to the Kochs. They started spending, they and their donor network, and that's sort of a point that needs to be made, because it's not just them. Their power is that so many conservatives, wealthy conservatives, look to them as leaders on this, and they started channeling their money and their donor network's money into more overt political involvement, and now they have this huge network of organizations that are sort of pejoratively called the Kochtopus, that are engaged in elections from presidential down to like city council, in specific targeted races. And so liberals rightly see them as a real rising force, conservatives see them as well, as a rising force in the Republican Party, to the point where they are, when we talk about the shadow party, they are really the center of gravity in the conservative shadow party right now.
So is it fair to say that the Kochs are essentially involved in political activity to enrich their own business interests and what have you? I mean, that's certainly a view that a lot of folks seem to have.
Yeah, I would challenge that view. I mean, there is in fact some overlap. You can say this of a number of donors, not just the Koch brothers. There is in fact some overlap between their political advocacy and the types of policies that they're pushing for, and the types of candidates who they support, who they believe would enact those policies, and their bottom line interests. In other words, they have a huge manufacturing conglomerate. It does a lot of emitting. They wouldn't use the word polluting. And so they are burdened by environmental regulations. They oppose environmental regulations. Do they oppose them because it crimps their bottom line, or do they oppose them because they see them as an impediment to, free enterprise really thriving and employing a lot of people, which is consistent with their sort of libertarian free enterprise ideas? It's tough for me, it's tough to do a chicken or the egg argument. I can, however, say that they have a number of sort of policy positions that don't directly line up with their bottom lines, and that they do seem to have been motivated, at least from my perspective, in part, if not primarily, by this ideological, these deeply held beliefs that they've had for a number of years, and so I think it's a little bit of a mischaracterization for liberals and others to suggest that they're doing this exclusively for their bottom line.
It also sounds as though, and you've written about this, as though at least one of the Koch brothers has some views that are actually out of step with a lot of the candidates that he supports.
Yeah, and this goes back to their sort of libertarian roots. Libertarians are in many ways closer on social and foreign policy issues to Democrats, to liberals, than they are to conservatives.
But tell us a bit about the views.
Sure. So David Koch, I had the chance to chat with him briefly at the Republican National Convention. It's actually notable that he was a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 2012, because that suggests that there was an evolution from their libertarian days to now, where they have in some ways come closer to the party. Even still, though, when I chatted with him, I asked him about some of these views that are sort of out of step, that I had heard that he had or harbored, that were out of step with those of the Republican Party. I said, "Do you support gay marriage?" "Yes, I support gay marriage." "Well, the candidate in the hall right across the street, Mitt Romney, opposes gay marriage, and yet you're a delegate for his election." "Well, I think he's wrong on that issue." Military involvement in the Middle East, Mitt Romney is sort of hawkish. "How about you?" "I think that we're spread too thin. I think that we should withdraw from the Middle East." Yet another one where he's sort of out of step. I asked him about, he was talking about the need to reduce government spending. I said, "Would that apply to the military as well?" He said, "Yes, it should apply across the board. And this is the one that really sort of caught folks off guard. I think we even need to consider some revenue increases," in that sort of code for tax increases. And you could see as he was saying this, and I was talking to him, his handlers sort of in the background, kind of like, uh-oh. And a few days later, they actually issued a press release that kind of clarified or attempted to, from my perspective, sort of roll back some of his comments by suggesting that they were part of a broader policy prescription that he saw as important to reducing our spending.
But the Kochs weren't the only mega donors who were active in the 2012 race. Who were some of the others?
Yeah, Sheldon Adelson is one that is commonly cited as the sort of quintessential rogue billionaire. He's a Las Vegas casino mogul, Las Vegas Sands, the Venetian, and his companies. And he spent $20 million supporting the presidential campaign of Newt Gingrich, who, folks like us, political observers, would have realized and told him go again. There's just no way in hell that Newt Gingrich is going to win the Republican nomination. Even if he did, there's no way he's going to be elected president. In fact, folks were telling Sheldon Adelson that, and they were urging him not to give because they rightly feared that any spending that was done on Newt Gingrich's behalf could hurt Mitt Romney, who at that point was regarded, again rightly, as the presumptive Republican nominee. And if the primary was dragged out because some other candidate was able to sort of throw a wrench into his coronation, then that would send Mitt Romney limping into the general election against Barack Obama. Well, Sheldon Adelson just completely ignored all that advice, and it gets at sort of this dynamic that I think you see across these mega donors, where these are guys who have been, and they are mostly guys, who have been extremely successful in whatever their chosen field of business, has accumulated billions of dollars, and sometimes, oftentimes, and certainly in Sheldon Adelson's case, by bucking conventional wisdom. People told Sheldon Adelson, Las Vegas is a gambling town. It's not about conventions. It's not about family travel. And he said, you know what, screw you. I'm going to make a convention business out there. And he made billions. People told him, don't go into Macau, the region of China where there's gaming. That's not high-end gaming. He went in there. He made billions. And so people telling him, don't support Newt Gingrich. He's got no chance. He thinks he's got the instinct. And so he thinks, I'm going to prove all these guys wrong again. So it actually backfires.
So that leads to a larger thought, which is that, yes, there's a huge amount of money being poured into the system, but to what extent is it actually mega donors who are getting fleeced? In 2012, you had these super PACs funded by billionaires and millionaires, and in some cases, it just seemed as though they were just bidding up the price of TV ads. They didn't get Mitt Romney elected president, certainly. And recently, we had the House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, Republican who is a tremendous fundraiser, spent enormous amounts of money to win a primary in his home district, and he gets beaten by a college professor who is barely spending any money at all. So, I mean, how important is big money in actually determining political outcomes?
I think it's very important at the highest level to get candidates in the game. In other words, I don't think a presidential campaign in 2016 or beyond can be run effectively with just sort of grassroots activism and small donations, like what we saw, frankly, with President Obama in 2008, which you alluded to earlier. In fact, in my book, I have President Obama talking to a number of very wealthy donors, including Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, the Microsoft CEO, who just plunked down $2 billion for the Los Angeles Clippers. This was in 2012 during his presidential campaign, and he's kind of bemoaning the state of campaign finance today. And he's saying, I don't think another candidate will be able to win the way I won in 2008, which was to come out without a lot of special interest, big money support, and sort of build that grassroots base. And then eventually he did, and he acknowledges he did, in fact, win some big money support. But he says in the Citizens United age, that's not really possible. You now have the possibility, he's talking to the donors, of 200 donors deciding who gets elected president every single time. And they kind of they're a little uncomfortable with this, my sources tell me. But he goes even further. He says, in fact, there are 5 or 6 people in this room tonight who could determine, if not who is elected president, at least who gets the major party nomination. Goes even further, steps towards Gates. He says, in fact, Bill, you could just write a check that would swamp everything. And Gates is standing there. My sources tell me he's got his hands in his